today we're in a moment that feels like 1938 to me. We've got this sort of feeling of foreboding on the horizon. We don't know what's going to happen, but it doesn't feel good. And looking back how people felt in 1938, there's a similarity there.
Hello. On the 12th of March 1938, German troops crossed the border into Austria, thus completing the Anschluss, the annexation by Germany. Resistance was non-existent. In fact, the Wehrmacht was greeted by cheering crowds as Nazi flags were draped over the beautiful city of Vienna. The referendum that followed may have achieved a 99.7% approval, but many in Europe were fearful of a coming war. Jane Thynne, author of Midnight in Vienna, joins to discuss the city during the 1930s and that feeling of foreboding as communists, Nazis and spies mixed in the City of Music as it's known. Coming up on Saturday, I have our Operation Market Garden special starting as Saul David discusses Arnhem, Al Murray chats the 17th of September, a crucial day in the battle, then Gordon and Philip return to discuss the operation as a whole before we round it off with our film club and A Bridge Too Far. Please do share, and if you can give a kind rating, that would be great. Thanks to those that have already. But until then, it's Jane Thynne talking Vienna. Jane Thynne, welcome to the podcast. This is actually your second appearance because we had a group discussion recently, but welcome. This is dedicated to you and your new book, Midnight in Vienna, but welcome.
Thank you. It's so great to be here and, second time even luckier.
Yes. So we're going to talk about your novel, detective stories, generally writing about this period which is set during the 1930s. So, of course, that involves National Socialism and Nazis, which always makes for a popular subject. And so I wanted to start really with the novel Midnight in Vienna, and it is the Anschluss is this sort of key event really. And for the benefit of listeners, that's when the Germans invade. Annex Austria actually is probably I tell you what, you know a lot more about it than I. Why don't I stop garbling and let you explain?
So, just to go back to the beginning, Hitler was actually born in Austria and was Austrian, and so Austria had and particularly Vienna, had burned in his heart. He'd had a very unfortunate experience in Vienna in that he had gone there to try and become an artist, and he was a painter, and he tried to join the School of Art, and he'd been rejected not once but twice, and this feeling of this rejection absolutely stung him. He'd lived almost as a down and out while he was doing this, and so his years in Vienna had actually fueled this kind of desire to come back one day and, to amalgamate it into a kind of greater Reich. So fast forward more than a decade, and he's in power, and he makes plans to annex Austria. And the plans are drawn up, and in fact, they actually did a sort of referendum, which was 99%. They declared of the population would like to be amalgamated with Germany. It's like one of those, Russian or kind of Baltic state referendums you used to see. Anyhow, March 12th, 1938, they crossed the border, and the German troops rolled into Austria, and this is called the Anschluss. And it was, of course, absolutely devastating for the Jewish population in Vienna, who had been so important to this city. One of the reasons I was so interested in it had been this crucible of thought. It's this complete the juncture of Europe where you got a lot of people coming in from the East, and it's a place we associate with Sigmund Freud and Loos in architecture, and Egon Schiele and Klimt, all these kind of very, very fascinating and boundary pushing artists. So Vienna was a sort of crucible of thought, and many of those people doing the thinking and the painting were Jewish. And so when Hitler arrived, this was absolutely devastating time, and gradually they began to round up the Jews and deport them, although many left before that. So I'd always been fascinated by Vienna. It's such a good and interesting place to visit, and such an extraordinary history. So in Midnight in Vienna, a big part of the story takes place in Vienna.
I couldn't agree more. Vienna, I visited for my 10th wedding anniversary of Vienna, and I had these plans I laid out very carefully I think we spent about 4 or 5 days there, but I can't help, there's so much history, not just from the 1930s and the Second World War and the Cold War, of course, but going further back, with Austro-Hungary and, the magnificent palaces. You've written under another name. I don't know. Am I allowed to say that you've written
Yeah,
under another name?
my two alternative histories written under the pen name C.J. Carey. One was called Widow Land, and the second was called Queen High. And yes, I've written, I think, 14, 15, maybe even 16 novels set in the 30s and 40s. And so I'm kind of fascinated by that period of history, and about Europe at that time. Although my alternative histories were set in the 50s, and they were about an occupied Britain, so that was slightly different.
Yes, I'm very keen. We're not going to cover that today, but
Mm.
for listeners itching to know about that, I'm very keen to get Jane back on to talk about that and a particular figure in the name of Wallace Simpson, who is very important in these novels. But anyway, that's enough of that for now. So going back to,
She's
was
the
it
gift that
really?
goes on giving.
Yes, exactly. But going back to sort of Austria, Vienna,
Mm.
1930, was it that sort of weight of history behind it that, I mean, what was your inspiration for the story? It surely goes beyond merely the 1930s and Nazism. Is there something about Austria and Vienna itself?
Austria itself, so interesting in the 20s, where there'd been this great struggle between left and right, and there'd been the Heimwehr, who were the kind of right-wing home guard, effectively, and then communists. And all sorts of people, including the young Kim Philby, became involved in this. Kim Philby came over to Vienna in the early 1930s, pretty shortly out of university, and became involved in communist circles, and met a woman called, met several people, met a woman called Edith Sushitsky, whose father ran a very important sort of social democrat book shop in Vienna. And so these circles were kind of relatively covert. And at that point, Philby met a woman called Litzy, who became his wife, and that was a whole other thing. But I love the fact that so many of these tentacles of British espionage reached back to Vienna. And that's why I wanted an espionage story set in Vienna. It was a really important city for what happened in the British espionage circles. There was a man called Arnold Deutsch, who was at the University of Vienna, a psychology teacher, who came over to England specifically to recruit young, well-born, discontented, well-connected men. And so he became a key recruiter for the Philby Burgess Blunt Circle. And he was, in fact, cousin, I think it is, of Otto Deutsch. I'm trying to remember what his actual relationship was. But anyhow, he came over, he became a recruiter, and he had come from Vienna too. So Vienna was this point at which these struggles of these twin struggles of thought came along. I mean, I've written an earlier book, actually, it's also set in Vienna, about Hedy Lamarr, whose story is amazing. And in fact, if you would like me to very briefly tell you
Please
the story.
remind me.
So this is kind of Hedy Lamarr was a fascinating woman. She was, at the age of 18, the first ever actress to appear nude in a movie. And she appeared in this film called Ecstasy. And she ran through some fields and later had a lovemaking scene. And this was fantastically scandalous. And at that point, she was called Hedy Giesler. Anyhow, few years after she made this, and it goes without saying that polite society all saw it and all disapproved of it. She married
But they
the
all saw it.
Everybody saw it. She married the second richest man in Austria, who was called Fritz Mandl. Fritz was an arms dealer. He was also Jewish. He was an arms dealer for the Nazis, so he was tremendously on very good terms with the very senior Nazis, and he owned beautiful properties, and he owned Hedy effectively. She was much younger. He liked her to be in his castle and to attend dinners and talk to all these very important wheeler dealers. And Hedy was going stir crazy. She realized really quickly that she'd made a mistake. He wouldn't let her act. And he collected up all the copies of Ecstasy and all the negatives that existed, except for the ones that were in the possession of Joseph Goebbels and also Mussolini. And he had them destroyed. And he said, "You will never act again. You are my wife. You must talk to all these scientists and just generally be entertaining." Anyhow, what happened with Hedy was that she kept trying to escape. And in 1937, she did manage to escape. She caught the train, went through Europe, got to London, met Louis B. Mayer in London, and he said, "I'm going to make you a huge Hollywood star. We've got to change your name because Hedy Kiesler doesn't really work. We're going to call you Hedy Lamarr. You're going to come to Hollywood." This happened, but 1940, Hedy was getting bored of Hollywood. It was great. She was an A-lister, but at the same time, she felt she didn't really fit in, and she was very anxious about all her friends back home, some of whom were getting killed by U-boats trying to cross the Atlantic. So she came up with this idea. She sat next to this man at dinner who was who composed music for electric pianos, and she confided her fears. And he said, "You know what? Why don't we sit down and try and work out a way of stopping the U-boats' torpedoes hitting their targets?" So Hedy and he sat down in their house in the Hollywood Hills, and they invented something called frequency hopping, which was a way of preventing torpedoes latching on to boats by jamming frequencies. So they invented this thing, and they went to the War Office in America and said, "You need to develop this. This is going to save the war in the Atlantic. This is going to save all the shipping that's being downed." The War Office said, "You're an A-list actress. We're going to put this in a file, and you're going to go out and do some advertising." Fast forward to the 1960s, somebody opened the file in the War Office. They took out Hedy's plans, and they realized she'd invented Bluetooth. What she'd invented was the reason you have a mobile phone. She'd invented basically GPS, and it was astonishing. And so Hedy, who has since been recognized for that, attributed her great achievement to the fact that back in Vienna, she had spent evening after evening sitting around the table with scientists, nuclear physicists, quantum specialists, talking about these things. And that is where she managed to get her idea for frequency hopping. So I loved that story of Hedy Lamarr, even though Hedy had left by 1937. Studying Hedy and the life she lived in Vienna made me realize what a kind of fascinating, propulsive place it was. So in Midnight in Vienna, my protagonist is called Stella Fry.
Just terribly sorry to interrupt. What's the name of the book that you've written about Hetty?
Well, this book is it's the last in the Clarifying series, and it hasn't been published yet.
I
So
see.
I've just outlined a book that you can't read yet, but soon.
Well, no, it's
Um,
extraordinary story. I mean,
great
the
story.
gauntlet's been thrown down to, Jennifer Lawrence and Margot Robbie, really. They
It's a
need to step
wonderful.
up.
And Hetty herself was just an amazing character who kept inventing things. I mean, she only recently died. She lived for a long time. She was known as the most beautiful woman in the world. She was the model for Snow White, Walt Disney's Snow White. She looked lovely. And she kept inventing mad things, nothing else that was so dramatic. But anyhow, I think she's a
Wow.
great character. And you're quite right. Some actress needs to try and grab hold of her soon.
Wonderful.
But anyhow, that's another book. The book that I was so interested in Vienna, and I wanted to go back to it. And so Stella Fry this is a new character for me, and Stella is this interesting case because she's English, but she's lived in Vienna as a tutor to a rich Jewish family teaching English, and the Anschluss comes, and obviously they leave Vienna, they go to New York. And so she has to come back and stay in her best friend's flat, basically looking for a job. And it's 1938. And I desperately wanted a story in 1938 because I think today we're in a moment that feels like 1938 to me. We've got this sort of feeling of foreboding on the horizon. We don't know what's going to happen, but it doesn't feel good. And looking back how people felt in 1938, there's a similarity there. And one of the things that particularly caught my eye was the fact that there was a huge craze for detective fiction in 1938. The cozy detective novel, the Agatha Christie, Dorothy L. Sayers, was at its apogee then because everybody wanted to try and escape the rather grim geopolitics. And I looked around me in the shop and I thought, there's an awful lot of cozy detective fiction around. So wouldn't it be fun if at the center of my story, the beginning of my story, I have a cozy detective novelist who's murdered. And so that's what happens at the beginning. But obviously there's more to him than meets the eye. But that parallel between 1938 and where we are now was very striking. And the more I looked at the way people's minds worked then, the more you see these similarities. So that was why I chose that year.
With the annexation of Austria to make a sort of greater Reich, presumably you did plenty of research. So I wondered, was there an Austrian identity that Austrians felt they lost, or they didn't really care because they were now part of a larger project?
That's such a good question because all the Germans would always say that the Austrians were more fascist, were more true Nazis than the Germans themselves. And I think there's some truth in that. There was an Austrian, well, eventually it was an Austrian SS, but there was certainly an Austrian Nazi outfit that was, yes, more extreme. And you look at people like Ernst Kaltenbrunner springs to mind, who was Nazi leader in Austria, who was kind of really, really savage and vicious. And you can see, yes, the roots of that kind of extreme fascism are Austrian. So, but of course, the other side of the coin is Austria was full of incredibly, not only some very left-wing people, lots of communists, but also social democrats, also a lot of Jews. And so it's very divided society. So obviously Eichmann is sent in after the Anschluss to run the Jewish office to coordinate the elimination of Jews in Austria, the deportation of them. And to begin with, you still have things like the Kindertransport, where the children are able to escape to Britain. But that's closed down by 19, I think 39, 40, that ends. And then people are trapped. People are really, trapped. I'm always very interested in this idea of optimism and pessimism because the people that left, the Jews who left, were the pessimists. And I've always felt myself to be an optimist. And I always know, looking back, that I would be the person that said, this is not going to happen to me. It'll be okay. Something will work out. We're well known, any of those things. So the optimists had the bad time, and the pessimists got out. And so just a terrible and dramatic time that just swallowed that city. And you go back, I went back recently, and went to Judenplatz, where they've commissioned this big Rachel Whiteread extraordinary inside-out library that sits in the middle of this medieval square, just to commemorate all the Jews who were murdered there, or from there. It's kind of intensely. It's always been terribly emotional. But
What were the numbers who were
it was hundreds
murdered?
of thousands. I should know that number, and I'll look it up. But it was a lot. And of course, the
Mm.
other thing about if you think about books like The Hare with Amber Eyes, one of the things about Vienna was that those beautiful, beautiful palaces around the Ringstrasse were very often big Jewish families. I mean, going back to Fritz Mandl, the second richest man in Austria, he was Jewish, and he thought, because he was friends with all the Nazis, that he would be okay, but he had to go to Argentina. So, it didn't really save anyone. And of course, Freud, most of all. So Freud's road, Berggasse, features as a key plot point in Midnight in Vienna. And Freud left in 1938, and only left after, because he was one of those people that said, I really don't want to leave. And people would say, you've got to go. And eventually his rooms was raided by the Gestapo, and his daughter Anna was arrested. And eventually international friends managed to get him out. So he escaped, but he had less than a year to live by the time he went. So all those things. It's amazing to walk down the street that Freud walked down every day, and to sit at the cafe where he also sat. It's fascinating.
It really is. On our anniversary. Sorry, I'm making it all about me. I don't mean to, but
I
it's
want it
just
to be about you. Yeah, go on.
Vienna's so wonderful. Is that my wife and I, we went for dinner in the hotel. Oh God, Sachet Tort Hotel.
Saka, yeah.
Yes. So we had this delicious. I think she was lunch actually, but it was this delicious Viennese delicacy, and that's I think another thing about being in Vienna is with the food and coffee, cafe is so important. Delicious plate of chopped up heart, which doesn't sound very nice, but it was delicious. And
Selling
I
it.
was munching, scoffing this down. It was meant to be it was a romantic meal because I was eating heart, but I was we were eating this meal with a vast portrait of Emperor Franz Joseph II above in
Yeah,
a sort of red velvet room. It really was like going back in time. It's an extraordinary city.
it is. And the cafes are so important. And there's the kind of, there's a Sperl where Hitler would go in the morning, and there's the Landmann, which is where Freud went a lot, and the Café Central and Café Louvre, which features in the novel because it's where all the foreign correspondents would go. And so everybody knew that if you went there, you were going to meet some other journalists. I love that about cafe culture. I wish that London had it, but it really doesn't. These places where you're going to see people when you go in, and so cafes are really integral and just so civilized as well. So I thought, and the other big thing we think about when we think about Vienna in the 20th century is the third man, of course. What happens to Vienna right after the war? And I'm writing in 1938, so none of that's happened. But that strange kind of, I think that melancholy does pervade Vienna all the same. And so in my novel, I wanted to look at what happened to the communist circles who were there once the Nazis arrived. And just as in the Third Man, they evolve complex escape routes through tunnels and indeed sewers. You remember the Third Man, they have this chase through the sewer system. Well, that was there earlier as well, because people had to plan how they'd escape.
They're
So
offering tours of the cert. Did you
oh,
go on
you
a?
can do a tour. You can do a
Yeah,
tour, absolutely. And it's kind of I wanted to evoke a bit of that, the idea of the underground in so many different ways. And of course, what the novel is about emigres from Vienna also who've come to London. I mean, I don't want to do any plot spoilers, but
no
that's really
spoilers, no.
one of the things it's about. And so yeah, so Vienna is a kind of just a place of great fascination. And of course, as you say, if you look back to the Habsburg era, you can go around, for example, the Capuchin Church, which is this extraordinary, the crypt is full of all these tombs of Habsburgs. It's the central meeting place of dead Habsburgs and immensely sort of elegiac. But I have to say, so I went back to Vienna last month, I think. And what you do notice now is it's emptying. It's really emptying. It's a place, it felt to me, rather of the past rather than the future. I don't know if that's a comment on Europe in general, but I noticed how empty it was. But then anyone that lives in London is used to, a jam-packed city, and Vienna's not like that. It's got broad, the ring is kind of broad roads and fairly underpopulated.
Yes, that's interesting. I wonder if that's because is this down to property prices, which is inevitably seen in many European capitals, and the young are just pushed
Exactly.
out, and you can't have a city without the young.
Exactly that. So it's got a kind of almost museum quality to it, which obviously it would not have had when in the 1930s and 20s. But the other reason I liked writing about Vienna is that I've written so many books set in Berlin, and Berlin is not a beautiful city, whereas you walk around, I mean, nobody could call Berlin beautiful, but you walk around Vienna and you're constantly assailed by vistas of extreme beauty. So that was nice to not be writing about Berlin for a bit, but I'm sure I will again fairly soon.
I think you should. I went to the opera, the Volksopera, which is the less expensive opera house, I should mention to the listeners. I don't swan around the State Opera House. And in the Volksopera, I was expecting a second best opera house, and we went to see Rusalka, the opera by Dvorak, and it was quite extraordinary. But it was even the Volksopera, built I think much later. It doesn't. It's not. It's distinctive. I wouldn't say it's beautiful, but it was extraordinary inside. It was so incredible, and I guess that just speaks to the just sort of culture flowing through the veins of Vienna.
Absolutely, absolutely stunning. And I love also the what happened after that, where you get things like the sculpture of Adolf Loos, who decided to do very plain, unornamented things. And, he built something called the Michaela House, which was on Michaela Platz, and which was beautiful, just clean lines, almost Bauhaus, not exactly. So I love the fact that they pushed the boundaries and they moved on. Anyhow, half of Midnight in Vienna is also set in London. So maybe you can get me on the Trade Descriptions Act, but it begins and ends in London. And one of the reasons for this, my other protagonist, who's called Harry Fox, who is a disgraced ex-MI5 surveillance operative, has a particular job that tickled me when I first saw this. I thought I will write about that one day. In the 1930s, MI5 compiled this thing called the Red List, which was made up of subversives and communists and their sympathizers who, amongst the cultural elite, so writers, mainly journalists, artists, and they were all followed by kind of gumshoe, Macintosh wearing MI5 watchers. And one of them, so Harry is following Orwell. And I love the idea that George Orwell, the absolute master of the surveillance culture novel, was himself being surveilled in 1930s London. And he lived this completely blameless and rather sort of modest life, but there was always somebody on his tail writing a report. And I thought that would be very funny. My protagonist will be surveilling Orwell and Stephen Spender and Claude Coburn. But he won't be a fan of them because what he likes is detective novels. So Harry is a very keen aficionado of the detective novel. And of all the novelists, his favorite is Hubert Newman. He's a Golden Age novelist. He writes about vicarages, stately homes, murder at the opera house, that kind of thing. And Harry loves that. And so Harry feels almost personally involved when Hubert Newman is very mysteriously and dramatically murdered, as it turns out. He dies seemingly of a heart attack, but Harry doesn't believe it. And so Harry and Stella Fry become drawn together through circumstance in investigating the causes of this detective novelist's death. And what they discover leads them actually to the very heart of the English establishment.
That's wonderful stuff. The opening, the introduction is quite brilliant with a character stumbling out of his club, and one assumes he's had one too many glasses of port, but of course
It's
it's
something
not.
else entirely.
No,
So
no.
that's Hubert Newman. And I also wanted to bring in man I was really interested in is Frederick Lindemann, who was Churchill's closest scientific advisor before and during the war, became Baron Cherwell. And Lindemann had done this really interesting thing. He wasn't actually German, he was just born in Germany. But in 1933, when Hitler decided that scientists must be evicted from all the universities in Germany, that Hitler said, if we need Jews for science, then science will have to wait. So all the Jewish professors, physicists, scientists were no longer allowed to work. And Lindemann had the brilliant idea of turning up to Germany in his Rolls Royce, driving around all the universities and collecting scientists, taking them back to, and so he collected Einstein, surely significant scientists, and he brought them back to Oxford. And Einstein immediately went off to America, but other of them stayed, and he was responsible for that, and that's he wasn't really given much credit for it, but that was tremendously useful to Britain. And Lindemann was just fascinating, crotchety, brilliant man. It was said of him that when he entered the room, the temperature would immediately drop 10 degrees. And he didn't eat, he was a vegetarian, a bit like Hitler in a way, but a vegetarian, only ate egg whites, tremendously picky. But I thought I really want to use Lindemann in this. And Lindemann did this very interesting thing. Before Churchill became prime minister, there were a lot of, as we all know, a lot of kind of worries in different circles about German rearmament and the extent to which the Germans were building an air force. And a lot of people in the British Air Ministry believed that everybody was way too complacent about this. But it was very difficult for Churchill really to challenge this in Parliament. And so what happened was almost a separate intelligence network, channels were established whereby people in the forces could channel information to Churchill so that he had the facts and figures when he stood up in Parliament asking for more rearmament. And what Lindemann did was that he was the person to analyze the data and boil it down for Churchill so it was easy to cope with. And so he was very, 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 very like Hitler, anti-appeasement. And he was, like Churchill, anti-appeasement, and tremendously useful.
Right. Hitler liked appeasement as well, I
sorry,
think.
sorry.
I think you're right there.
Terribly useful to Churchill. And Churchill and him would just spend every night, talking into the early hours. They were very, very close. And I thought Lindemann's such an interesting character. I'll bring him into this story. So he is also involved.
Yeah, it's such an extraordinary. You talked about the sort of contemporary, I guess, echoes, but that whole discussion around appeasement is one thinks of it. Of course, the most natural thing to think of is Russia and Ukraine. and you've got this sort of optimist pessimist idea,
Yeah.
and I just feel, and then a foreboding of something bad happening today.
Mm.
I still feel like that maybe Russia isn't. I mean, what's happening in Ukraine is terrible. So I I don't mean to say that it isn't, but yes, you're right. That there's a feeling that there's something else coming. We just don't know what that is.
Yeah, I heard a very interesting anecdote, probably true, which is that the head of GCHQ keeps little bit of wiring on his desk, preserved in a sort of Perspex bubble. And the wiring is a sample of the wiring that runs under the sea, carrying all our internet traffic. And it's alarmingly small. And he keeps it there because obviously one of the most obviously disruptive things that the Russians could do would be to sever internet and telecommunication traffic like that. And so I'm not an optimist actually in this regard. I'm a pessimist, and I think that there are always, as Macmillan said, events, dear boy. There's always people can die, but actually, what you really notice amongst political leaders in moments of crisis is they don't tend to die. I mean, I remember people sitting around waiting for Mugabe to die. He didn't die for ages, and Churchill had a horrible heart attack but didn't die. So people don't, political leaders don't tend to die. So I don't think there's any, chance of Putin just dropping dead. But I don't feel positive about it. And I was having a conversation with somebody in the incredibly named catastrophe unit at the Home Office. And I joked, I was making a joke, it's foolish me. This was about a year ago at least. And saying, well, if he did drop a bomb, it would only be a 1 kiloton bomb, it would be limited, And then I laughed and said, and I've got a cellar. And she looked at me very seriously and she said, I'm glad you've got a cellar. And it's not a subject for joking. And I think it behoves people to be really much more serious and actually, stepping a moment into politics. I think we should be taking defence way more seriously than we are and spending more on it. That's my personal view. And I just think it's very foolish. And often I think that some of the things that convulse us and concern us, like many cultural debates and the debates around identity politics, are distracting us, maybe deliberately distracting us from real geopolitical matters that are threatening to us. So, hey, that's.
I couldn't agree more. That's something that a number of guests on this podcast have called out for, is more investment in defense. Well, it's the old saying, isn't it? To keep the peace, prepare for war.
Absolutely.
So, but on that happy note, Jane, what that means for listeners is don't dwell too long on all this. Of course, at the ballot box, it's important, but read fiction in the meantime.
Yeah, and if you need distracting, like back in 1938, turn to detective fiction. We've got one for you.
Midnight in Vienna.
Yeah.
Jane, thanks so much. This has been fantastic.
Oh, brilliant. Thanks so much, Ollie. It's really good to talk.
Thanks so much for listening. If you can give a kind rating, I'd be hugely grateful. Plenty more great content to come on the 80th anniversary of Operation Market Garden. But in the meantime, thank you and good night.